All right, everyone, we're about to go live. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Foundation, the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We hope that you'll tune in tomorrow at noon to the Museum of Mississippi History Facebook page for a streaming program celebrating Native American History Month. Chief Cyrus Ben and Delara Saunders of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians will explore the culture of Mississippi's First Peoples. We also have two Veterans Day programs scheduled for next week. On Tuesday, we'll host our annual ceremony outdoors on the Entergy Plaza to honor Mississippians who serve and have served in the United States Armed Forces. The event will begin at 10:30 a.m. and COVID-19 safety precautions will be in place. On Wednesday of next week, we'll have Kevin Green and Andrew Wiest from the University of Southern Mississippi's Dale Center for the Study of War and Society for History is Lunch to present Vietnam, War Abroad, Conflict at Home. Today, we are happy to welcome Roy DeBerry, Aviva Futorian, Joe Batts, Stephen Klein, and John Lyons to discuss their new University Press of Mississippi book, Voices from the Mississippi Hill Country, the Benton County Civil Rights Movement. Holly Springs native Roy DeBerry is executive director and a founder of the Hill Country Project. He was active in the civil rights movement, first as a Freedom School prep student, whose teacher, incidentally, was Hill Country co-founder Aviva Futorian, and then as a general organizer. Hill Country Project Board of Directors Chair Aviva Futorian works as a lawyer in Chicago on prison reform issues. After coming to Mississippi as a Freedom School teacher in the summer of 1964, she became an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Benton County. Joe Batts is a retired Benton County deputy sheriff and United States Army veteran. He owns a daycare and is a counselor at a Tennessee corrections facility. Batts' older brother, Clay, was also active in the civil rights movement. Stephen Klein was with the U.S. Agency for International Development and later president of an international consulting firm. Klein lives in Washington, D.C., where he has been an active participant in community affairs. And John Lyons is an Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker. He has been recording residents of Benton County for more than 15 years and is currently an IT manager for a nonprofit arts education organization in Chicago. We have our speakers with us via Zoom, and now Roy DeBerry will say a few words to introduce a video. After it ends, we'll hear from Roy DeBerry and Aviva Futorian. Then in this order, Joe Batts, Stephen Klein, and John Lyons. For those of you watching, if you have questions, you can ask those in the live stream comments section, and we'll put those to our speakers at the end of the program. Roy?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Good morning, audience. You'll see a cup here. It says, "Vote, child, vote." And I mention that because Miss Sarah Robinson is one of the people that we interviewed, and she put so much emphasis on voting. And I think given where we are now with the country, this vote is very important. I think no one can say that every vote does not count, given where we are. Again, my name is Roy DeBerry, and I want to thank Chris, all the folks at MDAH, the University Press of Mississippi, and the two museums who made this event possible. And especially our audience who is in attendance today via virtual. It is always a pleasure for me and my co-editors to showcase these wonderful people and these wonderful stories from the hill country of North Mississippi, a place not often focused on. And so with that said, we can now display the video.
My mother wouldn't talk about that often. We're back in the when they were buying people.
Slavery.
Buying people because my grandfather was a slave.
I'm on my way, freedom land.
My grandfather was Edmund Moore. He was a slave, and he came from Sussex County, Virginia. And he walked here, I believe he said. Took him 6 months to get here.
I don't know nothing much about it because my mama didn't talk much about it. But I would hear some of my grandparents speak about how they were sold and when this man come by to buy the Negroes. And if they had a horse, a mule, or something in the barn or something, they were destroyed. They would kill them, set the barn on fire. They would destroy all of that, they told me.
When I was with Daddy, he didn't own any land. He was a sharecropper with the Hamer. The man furnished the mule. He fed us, bought us clothes, and he got half of what the crop made. He got his part, you might say clear, but we paid for our part out of what we made. Sometimes we cleared something, and sometimes we didn't.
We day worked.
What does that mean?
Work by the day, 50 cents a day.
Tell us about it. How does that work?
Poorly. Poorly. Yeah, we work day work, 50 cents a day. I'm telling you, we had to get up early, go to work, and stay late. The men had to get up around 5 o'clock and be at the barn at 5 o'clock.
It was rough. Get up early in the morning. After you milked the cows, you got ready and you went to the field. And you worked.
You talk about a Negro woman have worked.
I bet.
I have went from plowing. I have plowed. I could hitch a mule and a plow and plow just like a man. I have picked cotton. I've chopped cotton. I could pick over 300 pounds of cotton when cotton was thick.
Chopping cotton, honey. Absolutely, that's what. 12 o'clock, come in and hurry up and eat dinner, and if it was any to eat, and then go on back.
I'm on my way. I won't turn back.
Oh, honey, it wasn't easy, but just somehow or another we made it. Just made it through.
Somebody would write it up and we'd run the printing machine and print the freedom train up. And I'd take so many, and distribute them out to different people, whoever was interested. I'd offer it to them whether they wanted it or not.
And the point was to get a representative number of blacks to vote.
The voting, so I can be a citizen, so I can be considered somebody.
I just thought, if regardless of race or color, if a person does the right thing, say the right thing, do the right thing, I don't see why he can't be treated right.
But I can recall that I knew that we was integrating the school, and I knew that there would be problems probably. I just know that by him being white, he could do what he wanted, and I could do what you say.
When I first went to Ashland, I really didn't have no really visions of what to expect. I thought it would be just like it was going to the all-black school that I was going to. I didn't know it was going to be, this hatred stuff that was going on.
I used to cry a lot because, like I said, they were just so mean, and you couldn't understand back then why. And we was little children. I was a little girl, and I didn't understand why people was being so mean.
They would call you a nigger, but it didn't hurt my feelings. I went on.
Well, when all is said and done, was it worth it?
Yes, it was. It was worth it. It was worth it. But like the fellow said, sometimes I said, Lord, why me? But it got to be somebody.
I would like for my kids to know that factor about my family, about the KKK within my family, my great-grandfather being a preacher. I want them to know all of it. I want them to know their heritage, but I want them to learn from that heritage, the mistake that their ancestors made. I want them to learn that mistake that they made. I don't want them to go along and repeat history in a bad way. I don't want that.
By and by, Lord, by and by, there's a better home awaiting, Lord, in the sky, Lord,
Well, I hope you enjoyed that short film, which introduced you to some 14 of the now 100 or so residents of Benton County, whom we interviewed for our history project, which became a book. My name is Aviva Futorian. I'm a native Chicagoan. I was at the time a high school teacher who spent 2 years in Mississippi. From 1964 to 1966. I came there as what was called a freedom school teacher, and at the end of the summer was asked by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, to stay as an organizer in Benton County. I was supported by the Colorado Friends of SNCC in the amount of $10 a week, actually $9.64 after taxes. Gas was extra. Next, oh no, that's fine. Leave that leave that slide up. Benton County is on the border of Tennessee in the center of the state. It has a population of 8,000 with a negative growth rate. 61% white and 36% black. Blacks have been leaving at a greater percentage than whites. The average income today is $32,000. 31% of the blacks and 16% of the whites live below the poverty line. That's today. In 1965, it was the second poorest county in Mississippi, which you probably know is a very poor state. Today, it's the 17th poorest county in the state, which is some improvement. Next. Poor as it was, Benton County had one of the most active civil rights groups in the state. Here, a few of us at the end of a meeting are singing "We Shall Overcome," which is how everybody ended their meetings. One reason that it was so active despite the poverty was because many of the Black residents owned their own land. They certainly weren't rich, far from it, but they were independent of white pressure. Next. Another reason the residents were so active was because of Henry Reeves. That's him up there conducting a mass meeting. He visited every single Black resident of Benton County when that resident turned 21, the voting age at the time, and gave them a lecture on the importance of registering to vote. When I was working with people in Mississippi in the 60s, I had no idea that Mr. Reeves had done that, and he wasn't bragging to me about it. I only learned it when we came back in the 90s to interview people. Almost everyone we interviewed told about Mr. Reeves visiting them and telling them to register. Those of you who saw the movie Selma may remember how Oprah Winfrey, who played the part of a woman who tried to register but failed because she couldn't state the names of the 67 circuit clerks in the county, when she failed, you could see all over her face she was embarrassed and absolutely humiliated, like it was her fault. Well, that's how Black people all over Mississippi felt when they tried to register and failed. Not only did they fail, but their names were printed in the local, i.e. white newspaper for 2 weeks. Next. One thing that the movement did was to make people feel that failing registration was not something to feel humiliated about, but was in fact a badge of honor. This is a picture of Bernie Alexander. She was a poet. Her poetry, which of course was political, was printed in the local Black newsletter, the Benton County Freedom Train. She had a record, made the record of trying to register 13 times and failing. So her name was in the white paper constantly, while her poetry was in the Black paper. In fact, because Benton County had such a high registration and failure rate, after the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, it was one of the first counties in Mississippi to get a federal registrar. Mrs. Alexander finally registered successfully, and along with over 200 others, voted the local judge out of office. Next. That's me with glasses riding the city of New Orleans back and forth to visit my parents and assure them I'm still alive. And on the right is Roy wearing his hair in the style of the 60s. And he was one of the first people I got to know in Mississippi. He was my Freedom School student, and he knew all the answers to all the questions I raised. More than that, he was an awfully nice kid. Thus began a 50-plus year friendship between two people who had the most disparate backgrounds, races, family incomes, educations, and neighborhoods. And yet, whenever we'd see each other over the next 50 years, we had so much to talk about that we simply couldn't end our visits. Roy was not from Benton County, but from Holly Springs in the adjoining county where SNCC had its main project covering 6 counties. When I started working in Benton County, Roy often worked with me, and he joined the college prep class I taught there in Benton County that fall and winter. We drove out together from Holly Springs. What I did not know was that on the way to our class, he would stop off on the way to Mr. Reeves' house. I thought to drop something off, but it was to pick up a shotgun in case we encountered trouble along the way. We never did, fortunately, then. After my stay in Mississippi, I went on to law school. Roy went on to college and graduate school, and then back to Mississippi. We'd see each other occasionally, and when we did, we had so much to say to each other. In 1994, after 30 years, we attended a SNCC reunion in Jackson, Mississippi. Everyone bemoaned the fact that the children and grandchildren of the local civil rights activists had no idea what their parents and grandparents had lived through and fought for. By this time, Mississippi had changed enormously, and it seemed the activists just did not want to talk about the horrible Jim Crow existence they had lived through, even though they had fought successfully to end it. So Roy and I and a third friend from Tippah County, Gloria Exaferis, now Clark, decided to start interviewing the activists to record their deeds for history. Next. These are three of the earlier interviews. They were very crudely filmed because we didn't have a professional filmmaker. Eldora Johnson on the left was 93 at the time. She's the one who talked about she could pull a mule, hitch up a mule just like a man, pick 300 bales of cotton, 300 pounds of cotton. She actually wasn't active in the movement at all. And I interviewed her because a neighbor of hers who was active told me that I would be delighted if I interviewed her, and I was. And when I asked her why she wasn't active, she said she was afraid that white people would kill her and her husband. And she felt she knew them because she worked for them. And I think she was right. The man on the right, the middle woman, is Mrs. Reeves, who was Henry Reeves' wife, and she taught at the black school and was fired because of him. The man on the right, Walter Reeves, is actually Henry Reeves' nephew. In the book, he tells a great story about how the big lawyer in town tried to coerce him, in effect, to work against school desegregation. As I say, these first 10 interviews were done fairly crudely. Next. In 2003, another reunion, this time of North Mississippi civil rights people, were held, and each one of the 6 county churches were to host the attendees. That's when I had the idea to get John Lyons involved. I think he was about 20 at the time, and he had already made a fabulous video. I think it was nominated for an Emmy, about the Illinois death penalty, and that's how I knew him. I gave the 10 crudely filmed videos to him and asked him to make a real film story out of it. I also asked him to come down to Mississippi for the reunion to show the film. I did that knowing that he would become totally enchanted by the local people and would want to continue interviewing with us. He did fall totally in love with the community, so that the next 90 of our interviews were professionally filmed. The film, by the way, called My Mind Stayed on Freedom, was such a hit that it gave us a great reputation even among the people we hadn't known in the 60s, and we then had no trouble interviewing virtually anyone we asked. Next. Here's an example of John filming, and this is the Crawfords, Jesse and Alverna Crawford, with John doing the filming. They were very early activists in the 40s and 50s. And I particularly remember Jesse Crawford telling us about how his father in the 30s took him in their horse and wagon to see the remains of 2 men who had been lynched. He said he thought his father did this to scare him and keep him from speaking up to white people, but he said it had the opposite effect. Next. This is the opening of our office. Well, by 1907, we had made, 2007, we had made ourselves into a project, adding Stephen Klein, and he's there, but I don't think, I can't see him. Roy, can you see him? No.
I think we have him in another shot.
Okay. An old friend from Chicago area who had gone to the University of Chicago Business School and then joined the U.S. Agency for International Development. He shared our enthusiasm for the community, and he had knowledge of finances, which we were not so good at. We opened an office on the town square and had a big party to celebrate with many of the interviewees and their families present. Next. Okay, this is our office from the outside. The not so bustling town square, though there are now plans to use the now abandoned courthouse, which is quite beautiful, for a historical museum and use some of our materials in it. Next. This is one more thing I wanted to talk about. I asked Sarah Robinson, who you may remember from the film, one of our interviewees and a good friend, if there had been any people in the movement who were not landowners or renters. And she came up with the name of Buck Nelson, who was a sharecropper. He never came to meetings, but she believes he participated in a school boycott, which was one of the movement events, and as a result was kicked off his property by the landlord, Billy Carpenter. Mr. Nelson had passed away, but we found his children. I believe all of them living in Memphis, and we interviewed them, and it is quite a story, which I think I'm running out of time, so I won't be able to tell you about it. But it's in the book. So next, this is our book. And you can read about the Nelsons and everything else in the book. It's a compilation of about 35 of our interviews. We decided to make a book of our interviews, and the University Press of Mississippi agreed that it was both interesting and important historically to be published. That's the end of my conversation. Roy, do you have anything to add?
Well, thanks, Aviva, for giving that nice historical context. By the way, when you saw that slide picture of me with hair back in the 60s, for all of you that see me bald now, I just want you to know that I used to have some hair. I had some previous involvement with civil rights at the local level in Holly Springs before 1964 Freedom Summer. I had participated as a young person in some marches and made attempts to integrate a local theater there at Holly Springs. So we knew segregation was wrong, and we knew things were not separate and equal. My brother Melvin and I had stood on the courthouse square back in 1962 and witnessed 30,000 United States troops come through Holly Springs on the way to Oxford to take over or take control of the rioting that was going on at the University of Mississippi during the enrollment of Meredith. I met Aviva, she pointed out, for the first time in the summer of 1964. And we have remained friends, as she also stated, for more than 55 years, which is relatively unique. There was an instant relationship, yes, teacher and student, but more than that. It was a friendship and mutual respect. I had a desire for information and knowledge, insatiable, you might want to say. And Aviva was a resource I took a full advantage of at the office, at Modina's Cafe on Memphis Street in Holly Springs. We would talk for long periods of time about subjects regarding Holly Springs, the movement, about who was in charge of the power structure in Holly Springs, and so on. So I used this summer to question and explore. Aviva will tell you that I use every opportunity to drill her and other SNCC volunteers based in Holly Springs for as much information as possible. I was like a wet sponge soaking up information. As an early mentor, a relationship based on trust, she helped me and the other students in our college prep class to think about opportunities and horizons beyond Holly Springs, Mississippi, and the entire South. In the college prep classes Aviva taught and I attended, we fine-tuned our questioning skills. Something Black boys in the South was taught not to do if you wish to stay alive. We were taught new and fresh ways to examine the novel and the essay. Moreover, we were exposed to a wide range of African and African-American writers, particularly people like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison, and also just history from the people's perspective, which was kind of unique. Not to say that we hadn't had history before, but I think we were taught to question things in a different light. As a result of her urging, I entered Brandeis University in the Boston area in the fall of 1965. And all the other prep students, including Joe's brother that I'll talk about later, were accepted at colleges and universities throughout the country. So you fast forward, as Aviva did, to 1984 and 2003 and 2007, key time periods in the development of the Hill Country Project. which Aviva has also mentioned, and you will find relevant information, as she pointed out, about Benton County, why the interviews, and why voices from the Mississippi Hill Country. But more importantly, Aviva and I would spend hours walking the tracks at Ruff College, talking about ways that people, first of all, we wanted to interview. And secondly, we spent hours talking about ways to structure the questions about the people we wanted to interview. So again, all of that effort and all the background that she just shared with you gave us the context for working with the video, but also meeting the people that she's mentioned and ultimately developing the book, Voices from the Mississippi Hill Country. So with that note, I will now introduce, and Chris has already mentioned some of that, Joe Batts, one of the people that we have in the book. You had mentioned that Joe is a retired deputy sheriff. You mentioned that he was the owner of a daycare center. You mentioned that he was also a counselor at the Tennessee Corrections Facility. He's also an avid hunter and also farmer. His older brother, Clay, whom I knew, was very active in the civil rights movement. And of course, he died tragically in a swimming accident in Wisconsin during the 1960s. Clay was a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, a person who was extremely smart. And the two of us shared a college prep class that our co-editor, Aviva, taught back in the 60s. So Joe was baptized in civil rights primarily by his older brother. So would you please welcome the deputy sheriff and our friend, retired now, Joe Batts, and he would share with you a few things about how this interview came about and something about his own life and whatever else he wants to share. Joe.
Hey, good evening, everybody. As Roy said, I am Joe Batts. I'm a lifelong resident of Benton County, except for the time I was away in the military. But I was born in 1950. And of course, during the civil rights movement, I was a teenager, and I guess in many ways stayed pretty much behind the scene while my brother Clay, several years older than I, was very active in the movement. Clay and I were two members of kind of a large family. We were 8 kids. Our father worked a 50-acre farm. And of course, you can imagine that there wasn't a lot of income that came from that. I guess it was about 1958, 59, we moved to a farm not far from here in which our father rented. And we stayed there until about 1970. I went to school at Ashland High for my last 3 years. We, the integration process had started a number of years before that, but my turn came, I guess, in 66, the year that my brother left. And I graduated there, went to University of Mississippi, which for me is kind of ironic. I remember one of the civil rights meetings that was held. One of the speakers was talking about why we were in those meetings. And one of the reasons was that it would give a chance for the younger generation at that time, me and many others, to go to schools that we wanted to go to. And they mentioned the University of Mississippi. I was sitting next to a friend of mine named Curtis Evans, and we just kind of shook our heads and shook our heads and said, not us. Well, lo and behold, we graduated in 69, and in 69, we both enrolled at the University of Mississippi. We both graduated from there. When I graduated, I got commissioned in the U.S. Army, same day. Spent 20 years, retired, and came back home. Again, another irony. When I graduated, I said I'd never come back to Benton County to live, simply because Benton County was, as I saw it, kind of a tough place to make a living. It also had, from my experience, an atmosphere that I did not want to be in. But things changed. Came back home in '73, ended up staying here with my father because my mother died. Correction. Yeah, my mother died same year. And correction, I came home in '93. I'm sorry, that was after I retired. And once I got back, my father wanted me to stay with him. So instead of leaving as I had intended to do, I stayed with him. And a few months later, opened a daycare center because at the time we had a number of teenagers in school who had babies and really had no adequate child care. So I thought that was one way that I could help out the county. I worked with that for several years, then went to work in the prison system in Tennessee. And 2 years later, because my father became ill, came back and started working with the sheriff department here in Benton County. I worked from 2004 until the beginning of the last of those years, the last 12 years, I spent as chief deputy with the sheriff department. So that's basically my story here. I met Roy. Well, I shouldn't say I met him because I had met him and Aviva years ago, but Roy and I started to interact once the Hill Country Project was formed. And we also formed a nonprofit called the Benton County Empowerment Association, in which we concentrated on helping kids get the things they needed for college. We had benefits and gave a number of scholarships to children in Benton County. So while we were in the middle of that, Roy and Aviva and the rest of the board started the interviews. They asked me about doing an interview. I wasn't too hot on that subject because that's just the way I am. And I guess in 2013, I consented to do an interview, and that's how they got me involved in this interview process and into the book. But the book itself, for me, even though I'm a resident, it's really good reading because many of the people I knew, their stories I knew from afar, but it was good to hear them tell their stories. And some of the things that went on in the book touched my life, some of the cross burnings and things of that nature. Also, some of the lynchings I had heard of from my parents, but my parents never dwelled on anything like that. And it was good to hear other accounts of what had happened during the early part of the 1900s and later. So I think that Roy, Aviva, and John, Stephen done a great job in putting together that book, and I really appreciate them including me as a part of it.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. It's mutual. Aviva, you want to introduce, please, Stephen?
John, I don't suppose you can at the moment show a picture of Joe in the deputy sheriff's car?
I don't think so. I'm not the host anymore. We can put it on the website.
Okay, it's a great picture. So it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Klein, who I said was an old friend from childhood. He's very modest, so he won't tell you about all of his achievements, and so modest that we don't know of all of his achievements. He's a resident of Washington, D.C., still riding his bike, yes? Are you?
True.
And he's He's been a wonderful addition to the board, very much working on funding and on education projects for the school, which needs help badly. So, Steve, tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm not going to tell you about myself, but I'm going to tell you about two stories in the book. Our book, The Voices, presents original oral histories in the words of the participants. If you're interested, you can look at our ebook that John Lyons put together that actually shows the speakers speaking the words that were the basis of all of the oral histories. We tried to keep all of the language the way people presented it, because the story is about the voices of the people rather than an academic book. I chose only 2 of the 35 stories in the Voices book, all of which are fascinating. I thought might give you a flavor of, some of the things that are in the book. The stories I will speak about today are absolutely amazing. They're stories from Spence Richard and the Dorsets. And in fact, I just saw the film that you saw, and there are 2 film clips of Spence Richard in the film. Spence completed his formal education in 8th grade, but he was a philosopher, brilliant in his view of the world, and a superb example of a family man. He passed on recently, but is still revered in the Ashland community. I consider myself very lucky to have met him. Spence's father was a sharecropper, and that is a problem in terms of the way people live. Spence was a sharecropper for about 18 years. He speaks frankly about the inequities of the system, which is comparable to continuation of slavery from the past. People in this system could never accumulate wealth. Spence later in life was able to acquire land for a farm and his house and managed well in his older years. Excuse me. Spence talks vividly in the story about his father's behavior with a white man who owned the land. People in this system, he says he could never understand why his father always was stirring stick in the ground and would never look that man in the eye. Spence thought and lived very differently. Spence said he was inspired by the local Little Rock school integration in the 50s, I guess it was, and was committed to education for his 9 children. He sent them to the Ashland School as part of school integration. It is astounding to me that all of the children had college degrees, except for one who had cerebral palsy and could not finish. The children were in college for a period of 30 years, and he managed to find the money to pay for their education. Never a new truck. One more example of Spence's rare brilliance. Spence's granddaughter was valedictorian of her high school class and an all-state basketball player who starred at Mississippi State. In her high school graduation speech, she recited one of Spence's wisdoms relating to personal preparation. And I quote, "Fellows, if you prepare yourself, jobs will hunt you. Otherwise, you will hunt jobs." An extraordinary man and a remarkable life. Second story, Dorses. Another memorable example of the power of education. Joe and Rebecca Dorse had 11 children, one of whom passed on at a young age. They lived in a house with 2 bedrooms, a hallway, a kitchen, and a front porch. No running water. They were a close-knit family. They were farmers who rented from owners in Mississippi. Rent was 4 bales of cotton per year. They grew their own food. Children got up at 6 a.m. to work on the cotton crop. Then after working in the fields, the children walked to school several miles away. In some years, after paying the 4 bales of cotton for the rent, they ended with little income. They lived on that farm for about 20 years. When their rent was raised to 5 bales of cotton, the family moved to a home in Memphis, where one of the older children had a job. The family still owns that home. The Dorrs parents had a deep-seated commitment to education, similar to the Spence Richard family. The children were sent to integrate the local school and had to overcome and or ignore racist comments and social isolation from the white students during their school days. The oral history describes many incidents, including that the white students would not talk to them. And I would digress and say one of the stories was about one of the students who held his nose whenever the black students were around, and they surrounded this guy, and all of them were there around him, and he was holding his nose, and finally had to give up. Funny story. The oral history describes Rebecca's dream that she wanted her children to make a living with a pencil. That's the word she used. And that dream was realized. All children made a living with a pencil, and nobody worked in the field. The Dorrs family story is so inspirational. From a family growing up in significant poverty, they made it because their parents showed them the way. There are many other stories of this nature. I just wanted to illustrate a few to give you a flavor of the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to be introducing John. I've spoken about John quite a bit in my comments, so I don't want to say too much more other than he's a fabulous filmmaker and IT person, and he really professionalized our interviews. We were lucky that the first ones came out as nicely, though crudely, as they did. But John did a fabulous job with the filming. So John has now won an Emmy, am I right? You've won some kind of awards. Well, you've won several awards. So John, would you say a few words?
Sure, and I'll be brief, but thank you for those kind words. And the gratitude really is on my end. Aviva, when you called me up and told me about this project, it sounded very interesting. And my involvement, I think, was beginning to be secured when I saw the initial interviews you all did in 1995. That really set my heart on going down and meeting these people. And when I finally did meet some of the folks in Benton County, I was just blown away by not only the generosity and the hospitality, but also the trust that they showed us. And I think that is a testament to both you and Roy's involvement in that community for so long. You all made mention of how many people we've interviewed. It was something like well over 100, and 35 of which are included in the book. All of these people opened their homes, sometimes their church or their place of business, and in reality, their lives to us in ways that many times they have never done before. And that was really, really meaningful to me. And the other meaningful thing about this project is, you know, I'm younger. I was raised in the southwest suburbs of Chicago. Went to school in a an exclusively all white Catholic school. My education around the civil rights movement was fairly limited to specific people in terms of icons and leaders, and specific moments and places. The March on Washington, Selma, Birmingham, etc. It was very, very limited and very, very time and person oriented. So to look deeply at one particular place and really delve into what it meant for a family to send a first grader to an all-white school, what it meant for a school bus driver to register to vote, what it meant for a janitor to go to a civil rights meeting for the first time. That had a profound impact on my understanding of this movement and this country, really, and just how things, how change is made. And that was, I will always be grateful for everybody in Benton County sharing that with me. And I will echo everything Stephen said. I think we could, if we had another 3 hours, Chris will probably say no, but we could talk more and more and more about.
Yeah, I see I'm looking at the phone now.
Right, all of these people that we've met, who are so generous with their time, who are so fascinating and interesting and different, from people who were very, very involved to people who were not, like Eldora Johnson, involved because they were scared. Just their honesty and their generosity and their openness with us really made, more than anything else, this project possible and this book possible. So to everybody in Benton County who welcomed us and made this possible, we again say thank you. And I'll wrap up before we get to questions and answers just by saying, if you're interested in the book, you can go to our website, hillcountryproject.org. You can buy a print edition through our publisher, the University Press of Mississippi. You can buy a digital copy on Amazon and elsewhere through Kindle, but also, as Stephen made mention, we have, for those who have Apple devices, iPhones, iPads, etc., we've created an enhanced ebook that features recordings of all of our interviewees, so you can hear their voices rather than just see their words, as well as an enormous cache of photos. And we were really lucky to have so many really great photos from that time to draw from. So visit our website. You can buy the print book, as I mentioned, or you can buy the enhanced ebook through Apple's bookstore. The proceeds of both will go to a scholarship fund that we have set up through the Hill Country Project to work with young people in Benton County and assist them, support them in the next steps of their career and of their education.
Thanks, John. And thanks to my colleagues for what they have shared with the audience. And back to you, Chris.
Thank you all. That was great. We do have some questions. I'll just let y'all answer them as you see. Whoever wants to reach up and grab it. One was, how did the civil rights movement in Benton County look compared to neighboring Mississippi counties, and then also across the state line, the movement in Tennessee?
The question is, how did it compare to the other civil rights movements in the vicinity?
Yes.
Well, Roy can talk about Marshall County. What was interesting is that the county to the west of us was, I think, 70% black. The county to the east of us was only about 15 or 20% black. So those made the civil rights movements quite different. And in Tennessee, really didn't have big movements. They had some kind of poor people's tent city beforehand, which had been very roughly put down and I think killed a lot of the movement up there. But there was very little movement in Tippah County that had a small percentage. Well, they did have a movement. Nothing was like the Benton County movement.
I would just add to that by saying that in Marshall County, because of the population and a predominantly black county, as opposed to Benton County, which was a predominantly white county, you had much more land ownership in Marshall County, even though you had some in Benton County that we talk about in our book, but it was much more significant in Marshall County. And of course, in Holly Springs, you had two small colleges, independent church-related colleges, which gave a lot of people, black colleges, the opportunity to engage in some things that otherwise you didn't have, say, in the Mississippi Delta, where you had people, for the most part, living on large plantations and could be easily kicked off their land. So I think we saw where you had land ownership, that was a very important aspect of the movement and very important aspect of how leadership got generated. Mr. Reed, that Viva mentioned earlier, was a landowner. And that land ownership was important because it gave him the kind of freedom and independence that other sharecroppers could not have. That is not to say sharecroppers did not engage, because they did, but not to the extent that they would step out like Mr. Reed and others did.
We have a set of questions from Deirdre Payne. I'll read all three of them here. Does the Hill Country Project include the narrations of the descendants of the 60s Civil Rights Movement members who have moved away and succeeded in other fields beyond agriculture? Then she also asks, how many current Benton County students complete college or university? And then finally, is there a public library in Benton County?
Well, I can say that the first thing is we have interviewed some of the people who moved away to Chicago, but we really didn't interview descendants of civil rights activists. That will be our second edition. What was the next question?
There is a public library in Benton County. I think that was the last question. There is a public library, and also about the stats about schools.
Oh, yeah.
We have not, although we have worked with the school system, we got some anecdotal information about how many kids, what percentage of them going to college, but again, we don't have the specific information on that. That's something that we might want to look at. But my sense is that it's relatively small compared to some other places. I do know, though, because of kids we have helped personally, have gone on to community colleges to a large extent, and a few have gone on to universities like Mississippi State and University of Mississippi.
And I think it's fair to say that Roy and Joe are rare in that they've come back to Mississippi. Most black kids get out when they're 18, whether they go to college or not. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
We'd like to change that.
Yeah. Y'all spoke of Henry Reeves, who the book is dedicated to and who is a thread that connects it. Could y'all talk a little bit about the Citizens Club?
It was actually the local name for those who got involved with NAACP. Mr. Reeves used to go down to, I think it was Mount Bayou, but other places in the Delta for NAACP meetings, and he called his local group the Citizens Club. And it was the Citizens Club that the young men of SNCC got involved with in order to set up our project the summer of '64. So it was sort of the Hill Country, not the Hill Country Project, but the Citizen Club continued to work in the '60s.
Just to follow up on that, I think one of the things that we tried to point out here, even about the workers that came to places like Benton County, and we see that in the fact that there was a movement there already,
right.
That there was a local movement, and oftentimes people like Stokely Carmichael and Idaho Donis and others, they recognize that local movement. And I think it's important, I think we try to point that out in our book, is that this movement was not created in the '60s. There was a prior local movement that had been in place many years earlier.
That's absolutely true.
We are coming up on the top of the hour. You're right. We could go on for days probably with all the great stories. One question though, before we wrap the program up, the Benton County Freedom Train, are those, how many issues of that existed? How many exist? Have they been digitized? Can people look at those anywhere?
Let's see. John, why don't you talk about the digitalization?
Yeah, so they are digital. They are on our website. They existed roughly, Aviva and or Roy, Joe maybe even could correct me, for about 2 years, 3 years, maybe 2.5 years,
yeah.
With a lot of regularity. And we've digitized all of them. They are sometimes a bit hard to read just because we have very old copies of mimeographed papers, but they are really, really fascinating and interesting. And again, going back to what I said before, when you think about, you go one level deeper and think about what it meant to write these and then print them and then distribute them, and what it could mean if you were caught with one of them by the white community. It's pretty astonishing what they accomplished. But you can find all of those on our website.
And excuse me, John, just to follow up on John's point about the Freedom Train, and I think Aviva has mentioned this, and it's mentioned in the book, it was the only press in terms of free press, because clearly, you had a local newspaper in Hollis Springs, and you had a local newspaper there in Benton County, but those papers did not carry anything related to civil rights activity. So the only way to record that was these local people with this publication was able to record that news. And we would not have been known about any of these events other than to word of mouth had it not been captured and put on paper in something called the Freedom Train.
And you're referring to it as a press, but really it was put out on a mimeograph machine.
Correct.
That was sent down. I mean, it really, it's an amazing primary document to have, primary source to have, and it's wonderful that y'all have digitized it and made that available for everybody. That's one of the many great things about this project. Well, the book is great. All of the audiovisual aspects that y'all have created with it are great. We appreciate the work that you've done on these oral histories and everything moving forward. Thank you for being with us today. We do have copies of the book that are available for sale through the Mississippi Museum store here at the museums. Also, thank you all for watching. Don't forget about our program tomorrow with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, our 2 programs next week for Veterans Day. But again, thank you all, Roy DeBerry, Aviva Futorian, John Lyons, Stephen Klein, Joe Batts, for being with us today. We look forward to following up with you on the work as it continues.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And thank the people for voting.
Oh, God.
All right, that's good. We are off the air. That was great. Thank you all. Everybody's sound was good. Everybody's video was good.